Welcome to our segment on the early Renaissance in Italy. In this segment, we're going to be looking in particular at architecture and sculpture. In our last segment, we focused on early Renaissance painting. Just to give you a historical background, again, we're focusing on Italy. Italian city-states were controlled by ruling families who dominated politics throughout the 15th century. These princes were lavish spenders on the arts and great connoisseurs of cutting-edge movements in painting and sculpture. Indeed, they embellished their palaces with the latest innovative paintings by artists such as Lippi and Botticelli, who we met in our last segment. They commissioned architectural works for the most pioneering architects of the day. Competition among families and city-states encouraged a competition in the arts, each state and family seeking to outdo the other. Princely courts gradually turned their attention away from religious subjects to more secular concerns. In a spirit today defined as humanism, it became acceptable, in fact encouraged, to explore Italy's pagan past as a way of shedding light on contemporary life. So we have this movement back towards these ideas of Greek and Rome, sort of the golden periods of those ages. The exploration of new worlds, epitomized by the great European explorers, was mirrored in a new growth and appreciation of the science as well as the arts. So that's something we'll also see. We'll see this incorporation of, observation of the natural world, but still infused with Christian iconography. So, various city-states in Italy were using art as a way of announcing who they are, and this goes back to this notion of civic identity. This is a quote from Leonardo Bruni, and basically it really kind of signals how Italians want to be the successors of Rome. "O Roman people and race of Romulus" is one of the quotes from this very long quote, which I'm not going to read, but let you read on your own as a primary source. But definitely we have this, significant shift away from this sort of medieval aesthetic and looking back towards Greek and Rome in that golden period. So we're going to be looking at the city-state of Florence. This was a small city-state that had been targeted by the Duke of Milan. When he dies, the city of Florence felt as if God had intervened to protect them. So, as a celebration, a second set of doors was commissioned for the baptistry. The city held a competition for the commission. All candidates had to depict the same subject, which was the sacrifice of Isaac, and had to incorporate all 7 figures. So here is the doors. This is the first set of doors. This was originally done by Andrea Pisano. And eventually there'll be 3 set of doors that end up being commissioned for the baptistry. We're really just going to focus on the second set of doors. So all submissions had to be the same format. They had to use a quatrefoil, which is this sort of shape right here. This is very Gothic and sort of a throwback to sort of Gothic art. Brunelleschi was originally trained as a goldsmith, and Brunelleschi places Abraham on the axis, or the central axis, and it shows Abraham pushing back the neck of Isaac to get a clean cut. We'll look at some details. Notice how the angel is also physically pushing back. Note the knife-like folds of drapery. This emphasizes the form and movement of the scene. So this definitely really is very reminiscent of Greco-Roman art. Sorry, my phone's ringing. So you really get a sense of the body underneath the drapery, and definitely an attention to muscularity and the torso. So these aren't the flat, stylized sort of medieval figures that we've gotten used to. And really note the emphasis of force that and movement of the scene that Brunelleschi is depicting. There's also this sort of detail of a sheep scratching his ear, and the use of foreshortening Sorry about that. My dogs are super annoying. And he also has the use of foreshortening in both the sheep and a little bit in terms of the face of Isaac as well. And so Brunelleschi is definitely showing off his skill and showing this to be a difficult pose to showcase. So here we get that sense of artist and the individuality of the artist, and artists, claiming their talent and wanting to be noted and praised for it. There's some other charming details in here too. Here we see a shepherd towards the bottom of the composition, and he looks like he's sort of inspecting the base of his foot, and he's pulling out a thorn. And this actually is referencing a popular subject for this period known as the thorn puller. So you can see here in this sculpture right here. Um, so Brunelleschi's version not only depicted the subject matter, but also his technical ability and sophistication as well. The second artist, so I don't think I did a good job explaining the competition. So this competition was held, various artists had to submit an example or submission to get the commission for the whole set of doors. So it came down to two, Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. So we're looking at their two plaques. Also, to be clear, the first set of doors I showed you was just the first set. So we're talking about the second set of doors that's being commissioned. I just wanted to show you the first set as a reference. So this is Ghiberti's version. It's a little bit different. We see his version depicts Abraham's arm pulled back, about to cut the throat of Isaac. So it's a little bit different moment incorporated. And then Abraham is also looking into the child's face. And notice how Isaac does not return his gaze, but instead looks up at the angel. So there's that interesting sort of psychic gaze happening. His handling of the drapery is very different than Brunelleschi. His folds are definitely more swinging and lyrical. They're not so jagged and knife-like like Brunelleschi's. And definitely he's depicting Isaac with a very classical torso. I mean, look at that. I mean, that's pretty heroic looking. You can sort of compare and contrast the two plaques. I personally like Brunelleschi's better. I like um, the movement of it. And you might like Ghiberti's, but it's interesting. So just think about which one you like, and I'll reveal who won. Ghiberti did end up winning the competition, and Brunelleschi was devastated and left Florence to go to Rome. He was so upset. Some scholars feel that Ghiberti won the competition for economic reasons. Ghiberti was able to cast his whole design in one piece, which would have been less expensive to make. Brunelleschi's had to cast his design in 3 separate pieces, which would have been more costly. So there's that make that assumption as to why Ghiberti had won. So Ghiberti became a very acclaimed artist and got a lot of praise and recognition, and ended up doing a third set of doors for the baptistry. I don't have time to look at those, but they are or should be in your textbook if you're interested. So what happened to Brunelleschi? He decides to become an architect and becomes friends with Donatello, who we're going to discuss later. Brunelleschi becomes one of the greatest architects of the 15th century, and he lived and worked in Florence. In studying and sketching the ruins of the Roman Forum, he discovered the system of linear perspective. And we talked about perspective in the early Renaissance painting, but Brunelleschi is actually credited with discovering it. Which made art and geometry equally scientific and intellectually respectable. With Brunelleschi, the interdependence between architecture and sculpture ends. Donatello, who we'll look at later, had liberated the statue from its setting, and Brunelleschi's conception of architecture as a visual counterpoint of musical harmonies did not permit sculpture to play a prominent role. Exteriors are much less decorated than we saw with Gothic architecture. So in terms of comparing this early Renaissance architecture to Gothic, it's much more streamlined, much more defined, clear, not so ornate and decorated as we saw with a lot of the Gothic churches. So the Florence Cathedral also had a competition for the commission of the dome. Candidates had to bring in drawings and models to showcase their talent. Brunelleschi won, but ironically ended up having to co-lead with his rival Ghiberti. Can you imagine? It was said that Ghiberti was getting a lot of undeserved credit for the design, so Brunelleschi deliberately did not show up to a presentation. So when Ghiberti was confronted with questions concerning his design, he was unable to answer. Pretty sneaky. Brunelleschi was given the task of erecting a dome over a building which had been built 50 years earlier. And if you look, the building is more Gothic. The dome was to be the same size as the one on the Parthenon. I'm sorry, the Pantheon. But it must be put atop a pre-existing structure without the Pantheon's massive exterior buttressing. The existing structure would have to suffice as the dome's supporting system, so this was sort of a dilemma. Florence could not do a typical wood skeleton or scaffolding for the centering of the dome because there wasn't enough lumber available. So questions of how to deal with the down and outward weight exerted by the dome um, existed, and Brunelleschi came up with the idea of a double shell dome. So part of a dome hollow inside, making the dome much lighter. He also used stones locked in by horizontal ribs that were self-sustaining. There are 8 exterior ribs and 16 interior ribs. The dome itself is much more pointed and Gothic looking than spherical. It's a little bit taller than the Pantheon. He also was really inventive. He had to really come up with new inventions and ways of, um, you know, uh, bringing the resources to Florence, and he had to develop all these kind of pulleys and just these to build this dome. So that was pretty interesting as well. So here you can see a diagram, and here's the drum. There's an oculus here, and you see that sort of ribbing right here, and then you see the top oculus, and so this was the the outer dome, and then there would be an inner dome as well. So that was pretty different and unique. That was a new way of creating a dome, and sort of coming up with um, an answer to how to distribute the weight so it wouldn't come crashing down. So here's a detail of the laid brick in a herringbone pattern, and sort of this knitting and weaving the bricks together also helped make the dome self-sustaining. This technique required incredible skill and precision. He also incorporated a stairwell between the double dome, between the two domes, that allowed for repairs. And so it was a very well thought out design, not in terms of finishing it and completing it, but also maintaining and sustaining it for many years to come. Right? We're going to be looking at some other architecture, um, early Renaissance architecture. Um, Renaissance architecture, as I stated before, depends on order, clarity, and light. The darkness and mystery, indeed, that sacred sense of Gothic cathedrals was deemed sort of old-fashioned and sort of barbaric. So there was a movement away from that, and you can definitely see how very clean line and streamlined these buildings are compared to these ornate Gothic churches. And although all buildings need mathematics to sustain the engineering principles inherent in their design, Renaissance builders really seem to stress geometric designs more so than most that we've looked at. And that's something we saw with definitely with Greek architecture, rationale, harmony, and geometry. Um, and balance. Renaissance buildings seem to stress harmonies, and these were achieved by a system of ideal proportions learned from an architectural treatise by a Roman Vitruvius. And we talked about him before. He wrote this treatise on architecture that is a prime source and has been cited by many different architects. Um, so ratios and proportions of various elements of the interior of Florentine Renaissance churches were interpreted as an expression of humanistic ideals. So that's that word again, humanism. The early Christian past was recalled in the use of unvaulted naves with coffered ceilings. Thus, the crossing is twice the size of the nave bays than we've seen with other Christian basilicas. Um, and the nave the twice and the nave the and the nave twice the width of the side aisles, and the side aisles twice the side of the side chapels. Arches and columns take up 2/3 of the height of the nave, and so on. So again, it was very important to have this geometric proportion. This logical expression is often strongly delineated by the floor patterns as well in the nave, in which white and gray marble lines demarcate the spaces, such as we see here in Brunelleschi's The Pazzi Chapel. So it's nice to see that Brunelleschi really had a successful career as an architect, despite his loss to Ghiberti. So the funds for the Pazzi Chapel were assembled in 1429 by Andrea Pazzi, who was the head of the Pazzi family, whose wealth was second only to the Medici. Construction did not begin until about 1441. The chapel was completed in the 1460s, almost 2 decades after the death of the architect himself. The building is considered to be an early Renaissance masterpiece. The main purpose of the building was as the cathedral chapter house or meeting room for the governing chapter, and also used as a classroom for teaching of monks and other religious purposes. There was also a chapel behind the altar where the commissioning family had the right to bury its dead. The Pazzi's ulterior motive in building the chapel was probably to make their mark on the city of Florence and to emphasize their wealth and power. No big surprise there. The fact that the city was at war with neighboring cities at the time and they were still able to acquire the funds to build this chapel showed the importance it had to the Pazzi family and the people of Florence. So the floor plan is based on a simple geometric forms, the square and the circle, and I think you can really get that just by looking at the facade of the structure. And this again really reflects Brunelleschi's belief that architecture should reflect the right proportions, proportional ratios expressed in simple whole numbers. He measured classical ruins to arrive at these proportions. Besides being focused on proportions, the structure demonstrates Brunelleschi's desire for symmetry and regularity. His work in architecture revived classical vocabulary. So we have rounded arches, classical colonnades, tunnel vaults, groin vaults, arches within columns, architraves, like a Roman triumphal arch. So he really was looking back to the Roman architecture. So here's the interior of the church, and you can see the arches and sort of these columns. So very, very classical. Here's a much better picture. The other ones looked a little bit greenish, but definitely you can sort of see just sort of the rationale and geometry. The repetition of the square and circle motif is pretty evident. And so this is the stone that he was using was called Pietra Serena, which was a greenish sort of gray stone that he incorporated into the building. So again, you get an immediate sense of rectangles, circles, squares, semicircles, perfect geometry. And so the feeling is almost walking into an ancient Roman temple, centrally planned space similar to the Pantheon. So it might have reminded you of that. You get the feeling of being in a very ordered and constructed, designed, rational space. So very much different than Gothic churches, which was supposed to sort of overwhelm you. Um, um, we also see the fluted plasters along the wall, the hemispherical dome with windows piercing the circumference. Again, we can think of the dome of Hagia Sophia, the pendentive similar to that building here. So a little bit of a Byzantine influence. In the triangle space of pendentives, we see these medallions made of terracotta by another artist, Andre della Rubbia, who inherited a ceramic business. He had a secret glazing technique that was considered quite beautiful. His workshop created the medallions for the spandrels between the arches. He also commissioned other like medallions and these sort of ceramic details for um, other architectural buildings done by Brunelleschi as well. So here is a floor plan and an elevation of the Pazzi Chapel. And again, I think you can really see how he took a rectangular space and tried as much as possible to make it more of a square. So he was taking that sort of traditional basilica church, but trying to make it more of a square with a dome on top. And then you have these two barrel vaults um, or spaces, barrel vaulted spaces on either side. So he's almost sort of squishing um, the Basilica Church into the square. All right, so we're going to look at some other architectural structures. This is a granary shrine of Florence by Orson Michel. This provided food for the city of Florence in times of famine. We can see that it's a rectangular building. The arches were originally open. The building has burned down twice and been rebuilt. Major guilds were given a niche, which you see over here, to place a public sculpture of their patron saint. So you can see another view of it here. So Donatello. So remember, Donatello and Brunelleschi were friends. Donatello carved his statue of St. George for the Guild of Armorers and Sword Makers in Florence. St. George was the patron saint of the Armorers Guild and was known as a military figure, one who was well known in the Byzantine East, but who also was known by the Crusaders who battled Muslim forces in the Holy Land. In Donatello's work, St. George was carved with a confident posture. He stands tall with his shield in front of him that looks as if it could rotate on its small base, which touches the ground. This implies, at the very least, a sense of readiness on the part of the saint to quickly confront enemies coming from different directions. What looks funny about the anatomy of there is something that does look funny about the anatomy of the figure. The torso seems quite long, short legs, but it was done intentionally this way because Donatello knew a lot about optics. The Guild originally rejected the design when Donatello presented it. It hadn't been placed in the niche yet. Donatello agreed to fix it, but did not, and instead went ahead and placed it in the niche for the next presentation to the Guild, and they actually loved it. So Donatello knew proportions would appear correct once the sculpture was placed in the niche because viewers would be looking up at it. So, that was pretty innovative to be thinking about, how the viewer would be looking at it and sort of, altering the proportions to sort of compensate for that optical illusion. Next to it, I'm comparing it to one of the Gothic sculptures from one of the Gothic churches we looked at. This was sort of a transition where the Gothic art, or at least sculpture, was sort of moving back to more classical references. Not quite there, but there's this idea of suggesting contrapposto with the diagonal belt. Here with Donatello's figure, the legs are spread out. He's still not quite in contrapposto, though, but obviously much more classical than this figure. The figure originally held a lance that extended into our space. Um, so he's also depicted with a very alert stare and a youthful face. So again, this is very classical. So at the bottom of the sculpture is something called a predella. This is sort of the base of the sculpture, and he includes a relief sculpture of Saint George. Saint George, um, and again, it's very reminiscent of some of the relief sculptures we saw with Greek um, sculpture. In the predella below, we see how Donatello shades and molds by scratching into the form, and this creates this idea of light and dark, or this illusion of that. Notice the sharply receding backgrounds. This relief is more scratched than relief sculpture, both raised and recessed parts, and it almost looks like a painting. And then obviously light would passing over the forms would also enhance the relief as well. Donatello really had a great understanding of human movement and anatomy, just like the famous Greek sculptors that we studied earlier in the semester. Right. So this is another one of Donatello's sculptures. This was it's pretty controversial. It was pretty controversial back in the day, and some people are still uncomfortable with it. I think once you get to understand the background of it, I think the work is a bit more approachable, and hopefully you'll view it as something more beautiful. Um, the subject of David represents Florence civic pride, and so this is a depiction of the boy David who subdued the giant Goliath. And so this references the story of the Duke of Milan and how he tried to take over the city of Florence. And the story of David references the liberation and freedom cherished by the Florentine people. David was a young shepherd boy who slayed the great giant Goliath. And so there's this idea of the underdog winning. So this was a very similar metaphor for, Florence, who was a smaller city state, not being taken over by Milan. So this is a bronze statue thought to originally have been commissioned by the Medici family for their palace courtyard. It depicts the youthful King David slaying the giant. The figure is nude but wears a shepherd's hat and boots. And I think that's one thing that makes it somewhat uncomfortable, that he's definitely nude but also sort of dressed in sort of in a frilly way. Donatello's contrasting rough texture of hair with the smooth skin of the youth is something too that is notable. So there's a lot of contrast and details with the clothing and hair, and then sort of really smooth skin. Um, this was one of the first bronze nudes since antiquity. And so Donatello was very much aware of this. And so again, this is an important, reference, to Greek sculpture, because a lot of their sculptures were done in bronze. And so bringing back this technique was very innovative. I wanted to show you this other statue. This was done by a contemporary of Donatello, Verrocchio's David. Um, and people find this version a little bit more acceptable. But I thought it'd be interesting for you guys to see the comparison of the two. I don't have time to really go into detail about this one. But obviously, this figure's clothed, he's nude, he's not wearing the hat, he's wearing the hat. So, he's got this more serpentine sort of contrapposto pose, and his is more a little bit just, it's contrapposto, but his hip isn't quite shifted out, and it's not quite as sensual as Donatello's version. So we'll look at some details. David is depicted staring down and appears lost in thought. He wears a laurel wreath around his shepherd's hat, and this was an ancient symbol of victory, again, sort of going back to Greek and Roman times. Um, the figure of David stands atop the severed head of the giant he has slain in a very exaggerated contrapposto stance. The S-curve shape really enhances the sensuality of the figure. David seems feminine and androgynous, and I think that's what makes people uncomfortable about the sculpture. Depicting David before puberty, Donatello was said to have studied the anatomy of young adolescent men. This most certainly evokes a kind of eroticism that contrasts with the civic importance of the piece. So there's that sort of dichotomy and that sort of duality. And yes, it's a depiction of a boy before he reaches puberty. And the idea that this underdog could, win and overcome this big giant Goliath. And um, I think Donatello's choices are, I think, very intelligent and um, well thought out for his time. As I stated before, it was thought to be a private commissioned, and that is why the sexuality and eroticism could be so pronounced. We may never know all of its meaning. Um, Interestingly, though, Florence really embraced this as a civic sculpture, and they took this sculpture and made it a public sculpture after the Medici family was kicked out of Florence. Here's a detail of him standing on the head of the severed um, head of Goliath. And so notice the detail of the feet. David, I haven't pushed the eroticism enough, I'm going to now. David appears to rub the beard of the decapitated Goliath in a very sensual way with his foot. That sort of, he's like kind of stroking it with his foot, and sort of that helps kind of shift his body into this S curve as well. And something also is the feather. There's this sort of feather coming out from his hat, and it sort of kind of comes up his leg, or it's coming out of Goliathus's helmet. And it again, it has a very sensual appeal since it's sort of coming up and brushing along the inner thigh of the figure of David. If anything, we definitely see a significant shift away from medieval figures. And you also have to remember the Greeks loved the body, and they embraced the nude figure, in particular the male nude figure, while Christians had seen it as shameful. Um, so this depiction of a nude male figure is again this sort of idea of looking back towards Greek and Rome, and Romans or Italians sort of looking back to their Roman heritage. All right, so we're going to be looking at some more architecture. This is the last piece we're going to be looking at. This is done by Leon Battista Alberti, who was born in Genoa in 1404. He was the first theorist of humanist art. Alberti belonged to an important Florentine family that had been exiled from Florence since 1387. When the family returned to the city in 1429, Alberti gained access to the city's great architecture and art, which he studied extensively. Well versed in Latin and Greek, Alberti never received a formal architectural education. His architectural ideas were the product of his own studies and research. In 1446, Alberti, whose texts on painting and on architecture established the guidelines for the creation of paintings and buildings that would be followed for centuries. He designed a facade that was truly divorced from the medieval style and could finally be considered quintessentially Renaissance. The Palazzo Rucella, which we're looking at here, Alberti constructed the facade of the palazzo over a period of 5 years, from 1446 to 1451. The home was just one of many important commissions that Alberti completed through the Rucellas, a wealthy merchant family. Like traditional Florentine plazas, the facade is divided into 3 tiers. But Alberti divided these with horizontal entablatures that run across the facade. And again, an entablature is this horizontal space above columns or pilasters. So again, this is referencing Greek architecture. The first tier grounds the building, giving it a sense of strength. This is achieved by the use of cross-hatched or rusticated stones that run across the very bottom of the building. You can sort of see that right here, this detail, as well as large stone blocks. We see square windows and portals of post and lintel construction in the place of arches. So again, this is very much more like a Greek temple facade. The overall horizontality of the facade is called tribated, Trabeated architecture, which Alberti thought was the most fitting for the homes of nobility. Each tier also decreased in height from the bottom to the top. On each tier, Alberti used pilasters or flattened engaged columns to visually support the entablature. On the first tier, they are of a Tuscan order. On the second and third tiers, Alberti uses smaller stones to give the feeling of lightness, which is enhanced by the rounded arches of the windows, a typically Roman feature. So he's combining Greek and Roman architectural features. Both of these tiers also have pilasters, although on the second tier, they are of the Ionic order. Remember, the Ionic order was the scrolls. And on the third, they're Corinthian, and they have that sort of Corinthian, very floral, plant-like capital. The building is also wrapped by benches that serve as they do now to provide rest for weary visitors to Florence. Look at another view of it. So the influence of ancient Rome can very much be seen in this building. In many ways, this building is very similar to the Colosseum. Hopefully you thought about that, especially when we were talking about the three tiers, which Alberti saw in Rome during his travels in the 1430s. The great Roman amphitheater is also divided into tiers. More importantly, it uses architectural features for decorative purposes rather than structural support. Like the engaged columns of the Colosseum, the pilasters on the facade of the Rucella do nothing to actually hold up the building. The Tuscan order is an order that is derived from the Doric order. So in conclusion, humanist courts of Renaissance Italy patronized artists who rendered both religious compositions and secular works. After 1450, it is common to see contemporary events, ancient mythology, or portraits of significant people taking their place side by side with scenes of Annunciation and the Crucifixion, as we saw with early Renaissance painting. Brunelleschi's development of one-point perspective revolutionized Italian painting. At first, artists faithfully used the formula in their compositions, creating realistic three-dimensional spaces on the surface. Later, painters used perspective as a tool to manipulate the viewer's impression of a particular scene. Sculptors competed with the glory of ancient artists by creating monumental figures and revived antiquity's interest in nudity and idealized human proportions. Architecture was dominated by spatial harmony and light interiors that contrasted markedly with the mystical stained glass filled Gothic buildings. All right, so we might take a little bit of a break and go to the north in Europe and look at the Renaissance, how it's developing in Northern Europe. I'm not sure. I might continue with the High Renaissance. But anyway, stay tuned, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks.